This will serve as a brief demonstration of how a risk assessment or risk control self-assessment can be facilitated in IBM OpenPages. At a high level, you generally have two types of risk assessments. The ad hoc assessment would be an individual risk gets assessed based on a trigger. Maybe a loss event is entered and associated to that risk, or a key risk indicator breaches red, where that individual risk owner will be notified to assess the risk, and it may occur at any point in time during an assessment period. And then you have the formal risk assessment, where maybe a number of in-scope risks that might be identified as in scope for a specific line of business are assessed on a scheduled basis. And we see sort of a life cycle here of scoping the assessment, identifying the in-scope risks, notifying the risk and control owners to complete their assessment activities, right on through issue and action management, and ultimately monitoring and reporting. The approach we're going to take today for this brief demonstration is the idea that in a given company, let's say Global Financial Services Online, there's a new online banking division with its respective business processes, in this case channel marketing and transaction services. And because it's a new line of business, an assessment needs to occur for all of these processes, risks, and their mitigating controls. So it'll be a formal, scheduled risk assessment, and we'll see that how that can be facilitated in the solution with the following demonstration. We'll start as the ORM manager, Oscar Madison. This person will be the one that will be kicking off this risk assessment as previously defined. On his home page, he has under favorites that respective risk assessment, EMEA Online Bank Risk Register. Now, it has not been started yet, and we see that the status is approved, meaning that it was when the last time it was completed, workflow updated the status to approved, and once we kick it off again, we'll see that the status will change accordingly throughout the various stages of the risk assessment. We see ownership information, date information regarding the start and end dates for this assessment, and all of the risks that could potentially be in scope for this respective risk assessment. So let's go ahead and kick off the assessment, which will take us to the first stage, which is going to be the scoping stage. Now, I'm logged on as ORM manager right now, who also happens to be the RCSA coordinator for this risk assessment. So this is actually his task. So we'll just stay on this view for this first stage, which is the scoping stage. And this is where he might take a look at each of the risks, which will be different for methodologies for different customers on how they might scope the respective risks. But let's assume all three of these risks that roll up to this risk assessment are in fact in scope for the assessment. So we won't make any changes to those risks. Notice the status of the risk assessment itself has changed to awaiting assessment. So once the scoping activity is done, he'll take the next action, which is send to risk and control owners. We'll communicate to all of the in-scope risk owners and their respective mitigating controls and their owners that they have to do their individual activities in completion of this entire RCSA. Notice that the status of this RCSA changed to awaiting approval, and now the RCSA coordinator will await the risk owners and control owners to complete their respective individual assessments. We see that he has one action, review complete, but if we actually see if all prerequisites have occurred for him to take that action, we see that there is actually one item requiring attention, and the key items for this action, we see the risk identified here. If I select this message, it says all risks should be approved. So workflow has been defined to ensure that all of the in-scope risks have completed their individual assessments before the RCSA coordinator is allowed to complete the entire risk assessment. An example of workflow validations. So let's log out as the RCSA coordinator and log in as the risk owner, who is the owner of the three risks that are in scope. So we would expect to see three individual tasks. These are the tasks that have been assigned to the risk owner in this case, one task for each of the in-scope risks. Now that workflow actually called a child workflow, the specific risk individual RCSA workflow. So this is an example of workflows calling workflows as we go through this multi-tiered risk assessment from the risk assessment record to the individual risks, and then as we're about to see, to the controls that mitigate these risks. So let's select this very first risk here, R12334, or that task, And let's go ahead and complete the first stage of the individual risk assessment that Renee Owens is required to complete. So we see this individual risk is awaiting assessment. The current stage that she's on in this workflow is to complete the inherent risk assessment. And we see the view is actually targeted to just show the inherent scores, and we don't see the residual scores yet. We'll see that in the next stage. As an example of workflow driving the view look and feel throughout the stages. And that includes the view guidance to provide her assistance in how to complete this respective task. So she notices that there are no associated losses, there are no issues, there are no indicators in breach. So she's going to go ahead and provide a subjective inherent assessment of impact and likelihood as low. And then if she saves her changes, we see that the inherent risk rating has been automatically calculated to reflect the combined value of inherent impact and likelihood, and it is also low. So she's completed her inherent risk rating, and so now that she's done that, she can now proceed to residual assessment, which is the next stage of the workflow. Now, she can't complete her residual assessment until the respective controls underneath this risk have in fact been assessed. So let's log on as Christopher Oak, the control owner 2, who's the control owner for the mitigating control for this risk. So we log out as Renee Owens, the risk owner, and now we'll log on as the control owner, or control owner 2. And we'll see that, sure enough, he has a number of tasks because he happens to be the control owner for all three controls that mitigate those in-scope risks associated with this assessment. We'll just complete the assessment of one of the three controls, control 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, which is the mitigating control for the risk that we just completed the inherent assessment for. All suspicious transactions identified must be subject of a formal report. So there's going to be a number of activities he might complete to complete the design effectiveness, perhaps a control walkthrough. He determines it's effective. And then maybe for the operating effectiveness, after he completes the testing for this control, maybe the test fails and the operating effectiveness changes to ineffective. Perhaps issue gets created based on the control failing, and then issue remediation automatically begins at this point as well. So we'll save the changes here once he's completed his various assessments for this control, and he'll say assessment complete. So he'll do that for each of the controls that he's been assigned a task to. So at this point in time, now that the assessment of the control is completed, if we log out as the control owner and we log back in as the risk owner, she should be able to complete her respective tasks. Notice that she has R12334 is now in a new stage, residual risk assessment. That was the stage she left when we logged off as her for the control owner to complete his control testing. So now she's back on this. Notice that she now has access to the residual impact and likelihood fields because the underlying controls assessment activities have been completed. So she can take a look at the control, maybe go into its detail, and she sees that the test failed and the control is actually ineffective. So that may actually compel her to change the impact and likelihoods to be something maybe a bit more severe than the inherent values because of the control failure. And so she will identify the completed residual rating. We see the final rating of medium, and now she can say assessment complete. And she will complete that activity for each of the underlying risks that she is the owner of. Well, let's actually fast forward to another risk assessment that is already ready to be completed. So I'll log back on as the ORM manager. And instead of going to EMEA Online Banking Risk Register, because this risk assessment won't be ready for completion until all three risks have been completed, we're actually going to go to another specific. If we go back to my tasks as the RCSA coordinator, we see that they also have another risk assessment, North America Online Banking Risk Register. This happens to be awaiting approval, so it's at its final stage before completion, but we see that all three of the risks, if we went into them, they are all in an approved state. What this means is I should be able to then review complete. So notice the next assessment date is January 6, 2020. When I say review complete, after I've reviewed my risks, of course, and the underlying controls, any comments, any issues, any sort of information that can provide insight on the results of the individual assessments, notice that the next assessment date changed to February 23rd, 2020. So in other words, workflow can drive operations on a number of fields based on criteria. Maybe the next assessment date is 90 days from now if the underlying risks are very high, and it's 180 days if it were medium. Being able to drive that logic into the workflow can relieve the burden of the end user from the professional from having to update these fields manually. So the status is approved, this assessment is complete, and then through reporting and through other activities, the results of this assessment can drive additional activities, whether it's to close control gaps that I've identified, improve improper designs of controls, lower the inherent and residual ratings of the underlying risks. Thank you very much.